Hello, everybody. My name is Salil Tripathi, and I'm joining you from New York City today. We have our second webinar today. I'm from the Institute for Human Rights in Business, where I'm the senior advisor for global issues. And I have two excellent panelists with me today, Andrea Shemberg, who is joining us from Bologna in Italy, and Dominique Day. Andrea is the chair of the Global Business Initiative on Human Rights. So those of you who have been part of the business and human rights journey would know the work of the Global Business Initiative, which works with large corporations in promoting international human rights standards. And Dominique is an attorney, and she is more importantly on the UN expert panel of people of African descent. She's a human rights lawyer. She has a very rich experience in the Middle East, in Latin America, and she has a lot to say about the topic of the day, which happens to be Black Lives Matter at one level. We are looking at the upsurge of protest, of discontent, of anger that we are seeing in the United States, a global support around it, where we have sports people taking the knee in different parts of the world. Cricket match yesterday, England and West Indies did that. Football teams are doing it in Europe. We have marches in all parts of the world about it. And there's a lot of consciousness that something has got to give. It has gone on too long, and we need to find out why. And what we are trying to do is to see what's happening in the US and with US companies, both at home and abroad, and what can be done so that this untenable and unconscionable situation changes. I'll start with you, Dominique, the first question. That the legacy of the US original sin of slavery and racism is very much with us and has never been confronted fully. There have been important strides in the last 50 years, of course, the Civil Rights Act, and then the Congress looks at different issues. It looks a lot different today than what it used to. And companies have more minority managers, but still we have too few executives in the C-suite. At the same time, Black men are more likely than not to get stopped and searched, to get more likely to be arrested, more likely to die at the hands of police, as we saw in the case of George Floyd, and more likely to get on the death row, and more likely to get executed. Today, past and present injustices are at the center of public debate, even as a global pandemic and the economic crisis continue. How do you see this historic moment, and what role do you think leaders in different parts of society, including business, what should they be doing? What role should they be playing now to help move the society forward in ways that can bring about justice and equality?
So that's a great question, and so thank you. And also thank you for this panel and this moment that you created, which I'm very pleased to be part of. I do think this is an important moment. I do think we're in a space where we're seeing real opportunity and real awareness, right? There's these moments, there's the story of like Helen Keller, the famous blind and deaf woman, and Annie Sullivan, her teacher, is pumping water over her hand and signing the word for water, and then all of a sudden she sees it. And maybe we're in this kind of a moment. Maybe we're in the moment where we've been pouring water and talking about racial injustice and talking about the truth of living in Black bodies. And this is a moment where people are actually seeing how that costs all of us, but also what that really means about who we are. And to your point about leadership, this is also a moment for leadership. And I think there's something really amazing we can take from some of these young leaders out in the field, the Black Lives Matter folk, and people who are really spearheading today's activism, which is their own disinclination to centralize one leader who will hold both the power and the responsibility, and instead to define their movements as leaderful. So when people say to them, well, who's the leader of your movement? We're like, they say, we're all leaders. We are a leaderful movement. And just to be clear, this is actually an organizing position that has been taken by others. Right? When Google talks about organic leadership and the ways in which they try to have people step forward where they have expertise and step back and listen, where someone else's expertise is actually more relevant to the moment. Like that was something that was taken from the community organizing context. So this idea of leaderful spaces should be a real motivator and call to action in this moment, where every leader at every level should be looking around to see, what can I do in my space? How can I actually contribute to this moment? And how can I help create the world I'd like to see for myself and for my children?
Yeah. No, that's extremely important, putting the individual at the center and seeing it how it plays out for his or her at their life. I mean, absolutely. Andrea, you're looking at this situation as an American who has lived abroad for a fairly long time, nearly 2 decades. And you're looking at it from the outside, having looked at racism elsewhere, but you're also looking at it as a human rights lawyer. What kind of a picture does the US present abroad today? And how do you explain when people ask you what's happening in your country?
Yeah. Thanks, Salil. First, I'd like to thank you also for the opportunity to speak today with you and Dominique. I think the fact that you invited me, a white person, to talk about race is already a signal, and it's an important one. And it says racial discrimination is not just about people of color. The story of racism is a societal wide issue that involves all of us. And we all need to be part of the discussion and working to remediate the past and to do better in the future. And so thank you. I'm just really honored to be involved. So thank you for that. As for your question, I'll give you a personal account. This is not in my role as the Global Business Initiative on Human Rights, but so the United States, you're right. I'm an American, a human rights lawyer. And so for me, racial discrimination is a core issue, right? So as you know, equality and non-discrimination are at the heart of human rights law and standards, starting with the words in the Universal Declaration, which are all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, right? That's core to my work. And so for 20 years, I've lived in Italy, but my answer is based on that experience. I really can't speak about other countries, but perhaps more now than ever, the politics in the US is mirroring those in Italy. So figures like Steve Bannon are now advising far-right politicians here in Italy. So Italians look at the US and they see very similar things are happening here in terms of political polarization, the rise of anti-immigrant fervor, and politicians running on racist and fascist ideals. Thankfully, the institutions in Italy that make up the police forces have a different history from the US and what we know about slave patrols. But so the policing here has a different culture to it. But I think Italians look at the US now and they immediately think Italy's got some reckoning to do too. And in fact, they've taken a lot of inspiration from the Black Lives Matter movement here in Bologna, but across the country, we've had rallies. And I think for the first time in my 20 years here at the public protests, all of the speakers were Black. All of them were immigrants from Africa. And that was just extremely interesting because here, when you go to conferences or public events, usually it's white men speaking. And so that was really refreshing. But I do some explaining to Italians, and I find myself talking about two things mainly. When they're trying to understand what's happening in the US, I try and inform them on two issues. One is school funding, so that they understand that school funding in the US is based on property values. In Italy, it's nationwide, so they can't even understand that you're saying poor neighborhoods have schools with lower budgets, and so they can't really get their heads around that. So I talk about property tax, the system of school funding, and I talk about universal health care because in Italy, and especially in my region, we have excellent universal health care. And so I want them to understand the implications of racial discrimination are much more grave when poverty means no health care. So those are the two things that I generally explain when I talk to Italians.
That's very interesting because in a way you are anticipating where the conversation is flowing. And that's indeed the case that if we look at even coronavirus and its impact and who is getting hurt by it and who are the frontline workers, who's likely to fall sick and who's likely to die and who's likely to get inadequate treatment. The issues that you talk about, whether it is healthcare, whether it is about returning to work and getting the economy moving again, who is going to carry the cost? Who is going to bear the burden? And all of that is very much at the heart of what you just said. Thank you, Andrea. Dominique, I wanted to turn to you, that your work at the UN looks at how the world treats people of African descent. To what extent is the American?
Yeah, I wonder if I could quickly just add to something you just said. I hate to. I'm that person who always has like a thing to say, but I just to pick up on the points you're both making about healthcare. I will complicate the point about school funding, which is that in big urban centers, it's not property tax driven, so there is actually a political will issue. But around COVID, what we definitely saw this massive racial disparities that had a lot in the U.S. to do with access to healthcare, but also to do with bias, right? We've seen plenty of research that everywhere we look for it, we find medical bias and anti-Black medical bias specifically. So emergency department doctors who are particularly stressed, lacking sleep, overloaded with patients, make default triage decisions that have been shown to incorporate anti-Black bias. And what's interesting to me is that knowing this, we were trying to have that conversation on the front end of COVID, and nobody would have that conversation with us, right? Everyone was like, oh, the COVID, it hits everybody equally. The head of the emergency department at NYU Hospital, which is obviously one of the world famous hospitals, put out an email, said, we're not gonna have time or luxury for committees or data to determine our treatment rationing decisions. So we're gonna have to just rely on doctors' judgment and the institution will support you. From my perspective, right, of course, that's a recipe for institutional racism because you're asking people to make quick decisions without reflective data and without institutional critique, right? So you're ultimately giving people license to maybe engage in biases they don't even realize. But what we see in that, right, is this complicated space where lack of healthcare, lack of medical bias, and just the living conditions of a lot of people contribute to these massive racial disparities that interestingly start decreasing as the volume goes down, as the crisis subsides. So I think you're making a really important point there. I just wanted to uplift that a little bit.
Yeah, and I just wanted to raise 2 bits of information, 2 bits of research that have come up from Britain, but the findings are similar here. And I think, Dominique, you and I talked about it a couple of weeks ago when we first spoke. And one is a research that has been led by Open Safety, which is a project in Britain, and which looks at 17 million patients in the national health system and looks at who is likely to fall ill and who's likely to fall sick and who's likely to die. And there is a very strong ethnic element there. And there is an article by Angela Saini in Lancet, the British medical journal, which also raises, and they are driven by facts. So they go up to the point of making they're talking about the correlation, but not the causality. And that's exactly where what you are saying, Dominique, comes in, whether there's an inbuilt bias that if you're a person, and not out of design, but just the assumption that if you're Black, I should give you this drug and not that because of race. But race is not a scientific construct, it's a political construct. It's a very good point, and it's something we have to always bear in mind when we come up with reflex action responses. So thank you for saying that. But turning to to your work at the UN, and my question was, is the US experience unique? And is it different? And what are the lessons that can be learned from the US experience? And what can US learn from other countries? Because you have a global remit, as it were. And are there good practices that US can learn from? And are there US practices of eliminating discrimination, such as EEOC policies and all that, and trying to apply it even in the private sphere, whether that can be replicated elsewhere? Because I grew up in India, where there's an enormous resistance to affirmative action quotas in the private sector. So just as an example, yeah.
Yeah. I think that's a great question. And I think it's important to understand that this, of course, is not just a US issue, that we're the global nature of the uprisings we're seeing, of the outrage that we're seeing, has to do maybe in part with solidarity with the US, but I kind of doubt that. But I think it has to do with people's local experiences and the ways in which they relate and start to understand the everyday injustices they see are actually common, and perhaps common to people who look like me. And there's a reason for that, right? A lot of our countries, certainly the US, right, ultimately was grown in a context, in a broth of anti-Black racism. We have the historical trade in trafficking and enslaved Africans, which existed before, during, and after the independence of this country, or the creation of this country, I should say, to be a little more accurate, right? And what that does for us, right? What it did to us. And just to remember, let me go back a second, just to remember that it's not as though enslavement was a common accepted thing in that moment. There was a vibrant debate about it. Adam Smith, the father of capitalism, a god to some in the business world, thought enslavement made no sense and said it's actually going to take a despotic act, not a democratic act, to curb enslavement, because it's not going to be something the majority wants, but it's not necessarily economically beneficial to work people to death every 5 years, right? And so this debate was happening from the beginning. People were aware of the deep moral outrage, and what happens, right? What we see is that in order to create a space where enslavement can persist, we have a million justifications in every institution in society that habituates us to turn a blind eye or to even justify the enslavement of human beings. And so even after the point of legal reform, even after the point of abolition of enslavement, we still see social institutions that have given us a lot of normalization of anti-Black racism. And that's what we're grappling with today. So I think what we see in our work, right? So as I said, I'm the vice chair of the UN working group of experts on people of African descent. We do country visits, which is one of the most interesting things in our work. We go country to country, and we stay for 2 weeks. We do in-depth investigations. We talk to the government. We talk to private business. We talk to civil society, and we go to the places where people of African descent live. And what's fascinating is that in developed countries and in undeveloped countries, we actually get a lot of the same stories. We see people working below their education and credentials. We see people whose children have been pushed out of education systems and pushed towards vocational rather than mainstream education. We see these embedded denials of access to opportunity. We see a willingness to exploit, right? A lot of this stuff, we see people who can't make a domestic violence complaint at the police department because they're told, well, you're Black. Isn't this what you're used to, right? And then when we reflect it back to government, they often ask us, well, did that really happen here? So there's these issues seem really invisible sometimes at very high levels, even when we're saying them. Then our report comes out later and they're like, we didn't know. But I'm like, well, we had a meeting, we talked about it. So I think what we're seeing, but what we see, which is that we go country to country in the developed and less developed spaces and actually see a lot of the same stories, see a lot of the same issues. There's a reason for that, right? And the reason for that is that a lot of our modern global economy, a lot of our modern global relationships really are grounded in this historical trade and trafficking in enslaved Africans. If you look at the flight patterns, British Airways, for example, right? You're gonna see something that looks a lot like trade and trafficking patterns of old. And so we have to acknowledge that as we developed globalism in this world, that actually came within the trade in brown and Black bodies. And what we need to do, right? I'm not at all suggesting we would abandon globalism, but we have to understand that a lot of our familiar networks, a lot of our transference relationships, if you want to bring psychology into it, really have normalized violations of human rights against people of African descent. And because of that, there's these spaces that are very similar country to country, and people do start to see themselves in anti-Black racism they see elsewhere. And that is actually what makes anti-Black racism qualitatively different from other kinds of racism. This common root in this trade and trafficking in people that still gives us legacy mindsets that are very, very powerful today.
I've just been told there are some great questions coming in, so I'm going to keep an eye on that as well as we go along. But meanwhile, Andrea, I wanted to turn to you with a question which is about corporate America again, that most companies tell you that we are meritocratic, right? That we want the right person for the right job. It doesn't matter who they are, what their gender is, what their sexual orientation is, what their race is, what their language is, religion is, etc. And yet, if we look at the statistics, we see that there are only 5 Black men among CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. And if we extend it to gender, there are only 37 women who run Fortune 500 companies. Clearly, something isn't working, even if at the managerial level, there has been a change. Are we focusing too much on diversity and inclusion in terms of numbers and quotas? And turning to something you were involved with at the formation, the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights, where anti-discrimination is a major part of its plan. How would you apply that lens to view at the problem of structural racism so that we begin to ask right searching questions within corporations to identify who may be visible, what may be visible, but remains unseen?
Yeah, thanks, Salil. It's a great question, because when you talk about racism and corporate America, often the conversation immediately turns to a question of diversity, inclusion, and who's at the top. And I would say that applying the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights is the lens that I use, and I call it the human rights lens. And that's what I would apply to the situation of racial discrimination and US companies. And just to set aside the question of meritocracy, because I think that meritocracy or meritocratic approaches are also controversial. And so we can talk about that, and Dominique probably knows a lot more than I do about that. But I think when we focus on diversity and inclusion, it somehow becomes the only challenge that racism poses to companies. And it's as if putting people at the top is all that's required for racial discrimination to disappear. And so I call that the human resources lens to racial discrimination, and I call for a UNGP's human rights lens. And I think that it's crucially important, because using a human rights lens gives us tools to address the full range of company involvement in racial discrimination. Using human rights and the UNGPs, you look at company behavior and racial discrimination, framing it in a very different way. So just to be quick, the UNGPs describe that a company's responsibility for human rights is to ensure that it's not involved in adverse impacts for any internationally recognized human right. Well, racial discrimination is a human rights issue, but putting it in, framing it as a human rights issue is important, because then you have all of the human rights body authority behind you that gives you information on understanding racial discrimination, right? So we know from Human Rights Authority that it can be racist ideologies, prejudiced attitudes, discriminatory behavior, structural arrangements, institutionalized practices that result in racial inequality. It can be historically linked with inequalities in power, reinforced by economic and social differences between individuals and groups. And it can be the unintended result of seemingly neutral or even well-meaning policies and practices. And Dominique importantly pointed out, we have evidence of implicit bias, right, in healthcare and everywhere, right? So it's also recognized, Human Rights Authority also recognized that you may need proactive measures to guarantee what we call substantive equality, which means equality in outcomes. And as opposed to formal equality, which is the same rule applies to everyone irrespective of outcomes. So that gets to your meritocracy point. Outcomes matter when you think of racial discrimination as a human rights issue. So this human rights lens accepts racial discrimination in all its forms, and it asks companies to identify adverse impacts that come from its activities. So, for example, the reasoning would go this way. 1, there is structural racism that permeates every corner of American society. So companies should be asking the question, do any of my company activities, not just hiring and promotions, do any of my company activities exacerbate, contribute to, reinforce, prolong existing racial discrimination? In other words, is my company involved in racial discrimination? And this seems like a simple question, but it's a complex question. And in the area of hiring and promotions is one thing, but it would also ask companies to look at their products, look at their services, look at their research and development. Where do they sell? Where do they put their businesses? Where don't they put their businesses? And looking at business models. And Dominique also mentioned the flight patterns and the trading routes. Let's look at those international, globalized business models and also talk about that with a racism lens, right? Thinking about that. Who is at the bottom of those supply chains? Who are the most vulnerable workers in your business model? And so looking at outcomes, and I will leave it at that, just to also say with a human rights lens, the state is a key actor. So it's not just about companies, but I'll stop there.
Yeah, There's a very good question about, platitudes on one hand, because so many companies have embraced the Black Lives Matter logo on one hand, and the consequences of actions, and should we move beyond that? And one of the things I'm always intrigued about is consulting companies, which want to have diversity and inclusion quotas and want to increase the number of people from minorities that they recruit. And at the same time, they might be recommending to their clients decisions such as downsizing, because of the cash crunch. Companies don't have money, people are not spending. So I can understand why they might want to downsize. Then who is bearing the brunt for that? Among the people being let go, have they done any demographic analysis? Who are the ones likely to lose out? Again, it's a thought worth bearing in mind about the consequences of action, or not only what you do, but what you end up not doing and what you end up contributing. But you use the word implicit bias, and those of you who have signed up to the webinar today would have noticed that our third panelist, Ella Bell-Smith, is not here today. She has a personal reason for it. She's dealing with a family situation. She is a professor at Amos Tuck School, Dartmouth College, where I went to study, but many, many years ago. She has written a book with Dr. Stella Nkomo called Separate Ways, which talks about implicit bias. So I did want to recognize the work she has done. And Dominique, I wanted to ask you about those implicit biases, if you have a comment on that, since Andrea brought it up, that if she was speaking, she would have spoken about two different experiences, the Black woman's experience and the white woman's experience in corporate America. That the white woman faces a glass ceiling, and a lot has been written about that. She talks about Black women having what she calls a wall that they face, which has to be shattered. And you raised a very interesting point a couple of days ago when we were talking about the glass cliff. Can you reflect on that? Yeah.
Yeah. I want to take a second and just uplift something that Andrea had said. Sorry, I just can't stress enough how important it is to really think about the obligations of business through the human rights lens. And maybe just to talk for a second about some of the shortcomings we've seen in the DEI space, diversity, equity, and inclusion space, which has certainly created, right, you see a lot of coaches, you see a lot of DEI officers, but the studies have shown this actually hasn't necessarily improved diversity, but it certainly creates a checklist that people feel like they've managed the problem. The human rights space absolutely struggles to confront racism despite the written language of anti-racism in it. But what we have seen and what we do see is that there is this real challenge, and I think COVID's a great example, where the foreseeability of racial disparities, including written reports, I think CDC or somebody did a report saying a pandemic is going to hit Black folk much harder. Despite the foreseeability, we didn't actually hear anything from the DEI space in advance, including inside of hospitals. Whereas the human rights space, which wasn't necessarily talking a lot about it, was open to these sort of outcome-based spaces. Although I don't want to excuse them either, because to be honest, everybody was negligent. So, sorry, that small point. But I do think there's an important awareness that's developing about, I think, both glass ceilings, the ways in which it becomes impossible for women, and then even more so for women of color, with disabilities, right, for queer women, right, to actually achieve to their full potential because of the ways in which we understand what a leader should look like, what excellence is, how, there's lots of evidence that a lot of management styles that some women tend to use are more relational and maybe more effective, but are not seen as authoritative, although they may be dramatically authoritative in the actual context of a team. And these spaces where people are doing something a bit differently, and they're maybe doing it better, but it can't actually be cognized as such, right? That is actually a legacy mindset that has defined excellence through a white male standard. So this is another challenge, by the way, of the DEI space, which spends a lot of time habituating non-white men to white male culture, to a white male institution, doesn't seek to change the institution at all. Whereas when we're talking about glass ceilings and glass cliffs, we're saying there comes a point where the way that you're bodied is going to disqualify you. And while that's both unjust, from a business perspective, right, if your ultimate bottom line is about productivity or profit, I mean, hopefully your bottom line is also about human rights. There's no excuse not to have that. But if your bottom line has to do with accountability to a series of metrics. Excellence should actually be renegotiated with the skills and the talents of the people around you. But what we do see, and this is a very common thing for women of color and Black women in American companies, is these glass cliff situations, that at the point that somebody has financially mismanaged a company into near ruin, at the point that there's been embezzlement, at the point that everything is falling apart, at the point that things are irredeemable in all the normal ways, they say, okay, we have nothing to lose. Let's bring in this woman, right? And of course, it's a setup to fail, right? At the point that somebody has driven a company or its morality or its accountability to its people rating their ERISA funds, right? They've driven that into the ground. It would take a superhuman to rescue. And in fact, some Black women have actually made that their career. They're fixers by trade. But these glass cliffs where you're being presented what feels like an opportunity, you're going to lean into it because in fact, you've been waiting for this shot your whole life. You've been waiting for the chance to actually be and do the things you know you can do. These are setups to fail. And while a lot of times the candidate acknowledges that, often the people hiring don't see we got ourselves into this situation. Anything this person does that's positive is Herculean. But instead, right, that person often gets blamed for helping things go the rest of the way down. And so the challenge of glass ceiling is certainly the challenge of seeing more women and people of color in elite spaces. And to be honest, you see that everywhere. Right? It's not just corporates, right? When I sit in a criminal justice meeting in New York City, which has more Black and brown lawyers than probably anywhere on earth, the higher up you get, the often I'm the only Black woman in that room. Right? Sometimes I'm the only Black person in that room. So that shouldn't be able to happen in a space where there is no pool problem whatsoever. But we see it in government, we see it in nonprofits, we see it in corporate spaces. But these ideas of the glass ceiling and the glass cliff have been, and I think to the point of the book, right, have come to define how we understand our own roles in seeking success, in seeking advancement, in seeking to do the things that we know we can do. We're very aware that these are things we have to navigate or be resilient around.
Andrea, turning to you on looking again at US corporations, I'm just seeing there's a question from Raymond Bernal here about what, considering the current racial tensions across the globe, how can companies respond to racial justice? But and it's kind of tied in with what Dan Neal of the World Benchmarking Alliance has also asked. And so it's segueing very well into what I was going to ask you, which is that if you were to examine US companies operating worldwide and the fact that racism and discrimination is present in all societies and posing questions about issues, whether it's about factory or the pipeline or infrastructure, business models in and of themselves, when these attitudes are embedded in a society abroad, what can a US company do? Because the US company has learned experience from what happened in the US, 1960s, Ferguson, even going back to Emmett Till and so on, and to today. I mean, where we are in the situation today. And it goes to a culture where the discourse is different. I'm not saying it's more advanced or backward or anything, but it's a different discourse, and it is trying to apply certain standards there. What do you hear from companies that are operating abroad about how they are trying to address this issue of racial and economic justice? And I think this is where Dan's question comes in. What can we measure? What can we evaluate and what can we count that can tell us something to improve the performances?
Yeah, what can you count? That's another whole question, but let's talk about for a minute just what under the UNGP is what companies should be doing. Well, the first lesson is that we should always keep in mind that racism and xenophobia exist in every society in the world. And one of the, I think, lessons of the Black Lives Matter movement today in the US is that finally people are saying, oh, we have a human rights issue in the US too. Yes, and we have it in Europe too, and we have it everywhere. So in other words, there's no operating context in which racism should not be considered a human rights risk for a company. So multinational companies in the US are just that. They're multinational. And what do they need to do in those other societies? The first thing is never believe that you're operating in a vacuum. You are a societal actor embedded in the society in which you operate. And so you need to inform yourselves. So under the UNGPs, you need to be engaging with the people you will be impacting and understand how they are going to experience those impacts. And then you need anthropological, sociological research and help to actually understand the context. Contextual knowledge is key, right? But if I can just give a couple of examples that are quite simple, but you start to understand, right? So business development teams, as I'm talking about getting this out of the human resources lens and into the human rights lens, you need your business development teams that go and develop new projects in new countries. They need to be completely attuned to racial discrimination. So when you're looking at the siting of a factory, a pipeline, where the government has decided to put a pipeline, where the government has decided to put a highway or another project, asking the question, is this disadvantaging a minority population that where there is structural racism? It's crucially important that you're understanding the context in which you're going, right? In which you're operating. And you also look at government behavior. So governments are systematically, I mean, Dominique does country visits, so she knows better than I do, but governments are systematically targeting minority populations, in some countries, imprisoning them, torturing them. Companies need to be extremely vigilant about their relationships with those governments and making sure that they're not doing anything to contribute to the discrimination or the implications of that discrimination, the torture, the imprisonment, etc. So I think the main point, and I'm not going to answer all of those questions, but it's about understanding that racism and xenophobia is just everywhere, and it is part of any society that you walk into, and you need to understand it. And as Dominique said, it's often hidden, and so you need to educate yourself, and you need to navigate that. And I think that if companies take home that message, that's wonderful.
Can I add something? Just a couple quick examples.
Yeah, please.
So we were just in Peru on a country visit right before COVID, the end of February, beginning of March.
I was just going to ask. I was just going to ask you about Peru. Yes, please go on.
So we were just there, and an amazing country, an amazing people, the food. Never in my life have I eaten like that. But we talked to a bunch of people who were working for big agribusiness companies. What's fascinating, just exactly to Andrea's point, is these agribusiness companies, they would do their environmental impact statements, and they would actually present the music and the food and pictures of people of African descent in traditional costumes, and they would offer that up as a mechanism to show their comprehensive understanding of the communities. But then, right, the people of African descent who are their primary workers were working 12, 15 hours in times of drought. Even though the company is situated in communities of African descent, in times of drought, they would bring in their big machines and dig below. This was happening as we spoke. They had dug below and deeper than the community wells and actually sapped all the water from the community wells, leaving the people of African descent without access to drinking water. Right? So there was an interesting way that they had deployed the cultural awareness and cultural sensitivity to receive permission, right? To receive permission to get license to work in these communities and to actually use these people as workers. And yet their actual decision making was massively exploitative to the point that people didn't have water, people didn't have bridges, people were being picked up at 5 a.m, taken to the company, and returned home at 9 p.m. at night. And right, these were all violations of human rights, but also fascinating given that, I mean, this wasn't benign, given that they had explicitly been considered as a mechanism of getting this contract. Similarly, in Ecuador, we saw, this is a Japanese company, literally has people living in camps, no toilet facilities, no running water, no nothing, like no electricity, nothing. They work for the company. They go back to these very, very primitive camps that lack every basic amenity that we connect to human rights, like today. And so it's fascinating. I think what Andrea is saying is this is a space where corporate accountability doesn't have to actually do that much in some spaces to dramatically improve its compliance with international human rights. And the fact that they choose not to is terrifying.
Yeah, and absolutely. And what's linked to that is, of course, the whole element of intersectionality, because, companies do have an indigenous peoples policy, but if it is not thought through the angle or through the angle of race, or the linguistic minority, as the case might be, it might actually be missing something extremely crucial and important. There was another question which came through from Dan, which is building on what you were saying, Andrea. And I just thought I'll bring that up because there are some countries where you're prohibited from collecting certain information about demographics, about wage gaps, for example, and on ethnic grounds and so on. So one is, how do we negotiate that and navigate that? And the other point I wanted to mention, just in terms of cross-cultural issues, is that companies can be a force of good. And one example is, of course, the way the Sullivan principles were applied in South Africa. US had just grown out of the civil rights movement, and in the late 70s and early 80s, they did ensure that within the workplace, there is equal treatment. But there are also limits to that. So if you want to reflect on that, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so let me give just a couple of examples. I mean, the lack of information and the illegality of getting information is important. It's an important obstacle. There are often times when companies are going to be operating in contexts where laws are contrary to their human rights responsibilities. So in several countries, we have criminalization of homosexuality, for example. But companies need to navigate that. And what the UN guiding principles say is that you have to honor the human rights standards, irrespective of the local law. And so where it is illegal to gather that information, you need to seek out information somehow. So academics, you get the best that you can and you make the judgments based on that information, but you make the effort. And even if it's illegal, maybe you get that information from an academic who sits outside that country, and you piece together what you can, but the intention is that you're going to be measuring that and looking and trying to be responsive to that discrimination that you do identify. So I think, you make your best effort. And we've seen it in certain contexts where labor unions aren't allowed, but yet you can create workers' committees, and then little by little you get them to talk about certain things, and then you open up that space to talk about more, and lo and behold, then you have a grievance mechanism, and before you know it, you are giving some semblance of rights in a context where it formally is not legal. So, the UNGP's message to companies is, your responsibility is to respect human rights, irrespective of local law. And that dilemma, you've got to navigate it. And if you can't navigate it, then that's a question about whether you should be operating there.
Yeah, and what you say about the dilemma of operating at the other places has historical connotations and context. And you were talking about systemic risks again, Dominique, when we were talking earlier, and you mentioned the examples of Peru and Ecuador as cases where, the stories haven't changed, isn't it? If one were to go back to Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude and the incident of the banana plantation, and then if one were to look at Colombia and what happened with the banana company not long ago, about 15, 20 years ago, and the relationship that was with the security forces. So things don't appear to be changing. Now, there's a question from Innocent Mugwagwa, and we don't have to address it right now, but I do want to recognize it, but because maybe it is leading us in a very uncomfortable space to take this conversation, but worth having, which is the whole issue of reparations. Is there something that those with power, those with wealth, those with authority, what kind of reckoning is needed? Another question was from someone in South Africa about whether there's a need for a Truth and Reconciliation Commission of some kind. And of course, it's not the fault of an individual company for what may have happened in the past, but they are part of a system. They are inheriting a particular structure. Is that something we need to explore further?
Yeah, just to be clear, right? Reparations is a standard within international human rights. When we talk about truth and reconciliation, these are spaces we understand for actually resetting us to the proper standards, to the proper interactions with each other. And I think it's important to understand how far back, right, this goes. So when you look at the US, for example, wealth, right? The average wealth of the Black family is $17,000. The average wealth of the white family is $170,000. That's a 10 times, right? A 10 times disparity that has only increased over time and seems to be increasing even further with these massive unemployment at this point, and 2008, the crisis then, right? So the precarity of Black and brown folk is actually very significant. So we're talking about reparations, we're talking about wealth, we're talking about stability, and the interest of our communities in creating a common stability from which they can actually operate. Companies are not incidental to this. It's very lovely to narrow the time frame and look at your world from 10K to 10K report, right? That's a very convenient thing to do. But the reality is, we've seen the role of corporate spaces in this from the beginning. We continue to see massive wage disparities between women and men, between Black and white, between anything the further you get away from, again, who is implicitly defined as leadership and potential. We see massive disparities in who gets mentored and who gets shepherded into spaces where they actually have the ability not just to build their own wealth, but to build on behalf of the people around them. And again, if I can just harken back to history, there's a reason for this, right? Our entire context has been defined by exactly this space. There's a writer who I think is amazing. It's an Indian writer, Gayatri Spivak, right? She talks about the ways in which human rights, or the ways in which our modern culture seeks to create education, job training, all of it, seeks to create the ideal colonial subject, right? So now we've defined excellence and excellence for brown folk as being the ideal colonial subject who can serve the interests of the business, who is separate from their own local cultural originality, and who can perform, right? Who can tap dance for white supremacy, if you will. And that space, the space in which the ideal colonial subject is the highest space to which a lot of people can aspire, right? That actually does harken back to what does it mean to actually create truth and reconciliation? What does it mean to have reparations? Because part of what has to be dismantled in order for people to understand the importance of reparations, in order for people to understand what has been lost, right? What has been lost from these years and these millennia. To understand what has been lost, or centuries, let me not say millennia, right? What has been lost is actually the conception that not just equality can happen, but that people can exist in ways that are filled with freedom and opportunity and potential. If we can go back to that ideal colonial subject, which has defined our education spaces, has defined our employment spaces, that right there is a mindset that's foundational, that has actually already set us on different paths in terms of equality and racial understanding.
No, and you're so right to bring up Gayatri Spivak and her work on subaltern studies, which is all part of that, because she is actually referring to a colonial project, which was the original minute of 1835 of Thomas Babington Macaulay, who said he wanted to create a structure of people who are brown in color but English in character to run the East India Company's bureaucracy in India. These were the words he used. And when Salman Rushdie wrote his famous novel Midnight's Children, there's a very nice phrase in it, the night India became free. And he says that it was a night when a lot of brown men overnight turned white. And it's worth bearing the annotation of the color and the politics and the history and the background. It's so relevant, and about the kind of person we are attracting in the class element. And I'm glad you brought up this the disparity statistic, because I was listening to a webinar by McKinsey yesterday, day before was it, where I think the same statistics were given, and how hard it is, and how the expenditure patterns of a Black family in America are different because they have to pay more for healthcare. They may be paying more for interests on their banks or mortgage and so on, which completely
for food
makes life a lot difficult. And they've produced a report which might also be worth looking at. Yeah, and I wanted to be slightly forward-looking, because and looking at the UN guiding principles, which we've just the 10th anniversary is coming up, and people are talking about the next 10 years. So, having been part of the original team again, and not to put you on a spot there, what would you want to see in an instrument such as the guiding principles to guide the companies to the right path as we go along? Yeah, on this issue.
what do I want to see in the instrument itself, or what steps?
Yeah, I'm not saying reopen the principle because that's difficult, but maybe through some guidance, maybe through interpreting it more creatively, maybe by looking at other ways of making sure that we are mitigating harm.
Yeah, I mean that's really interesting. So I hadn't thought about it. But it might be a very interesting kind of addendum to the UN guiding principles to deepen the issue of racial discrimination and guide companies in that direction, because I think it is going to be hard. And as both of you said earlier, it's very uncomfortable, because the first thing is to understand that it exists and we haven't admitted it for a long time, forever, right? And understanding that there is, that racial discrimination permeates everything in our society, and that our company, the company itself is part of that, and therefore identifying those where we have been blinded, that might be very difficult. So it's an interesting question. I hadn't thought about it, and maybe Dominique also might have an idea about it, but I think it could be a role for the High Commissioner or for the working group. It's a very interesting idea. Yeah.
Since you mentioned the working group, we are lucky that Anita Ramasastry of the working group is listening to us, and she has just asked this question, which goes right at the heart of this. So I thought I'll bring it up, that how can companies really delve into racial discrimination and its historical context in various countries as new business leaders who are younger and possibly less aware of history, who don't even know what the Sullivan principles were? So how do we bridge that gap, and how can we, any thoughts?
Go ahead.
I would say, this is actually a space where this is a solvable problem that would not be challenging were it not for the inconstancy of political will, right? So, for example, Facebook just this week, actually, right? It was released, I forget what day it is, actually, to be honest, but Facebook released its civil rights audit just a couple days ago. They've already said they don't intend to take all the recommendations. It wasn't a flattering picture, right? But, and to be honest, it took years of organizing and activism to even get them to agree to that space. But these investigations matter. We believe when we do our country visits and we promulgate recommendations and we make conclusions based on what we've seen by talking to everyone we can find to talk to. It's exhausting, right? You start at 6 a.m, you end at midnight, you write half a report while you're there. But the idea is to offer as much feedback and insight as possible. And because we have such a robust human rights framework, and including amazing resources like the guidelines, because we have this robust framework, there's actually a very fantastic there's also a fantastic framework for investigations, for audits, and companies need to be doing this, right? Obviously, they should also follow their recommendations. I really do hope Facebook will embrace this moment. It has struggled to even to navigate things like hate speech and the possibility of weaponized speech versus free speech, right? And its challenge in doing that may actually create a space where it's also choosing not to confront its own systemic racism. But we do have this chance to do these investigations. When we do our country visits, it's free, right? Companies can just read our stuff and actually implement it. But also, we see companies doing internal investigations around everything under the sun, right? There's an entire industry of this. And in fact, there's now an industry of race experts who do racial equity audits and look at this. And so it's not a small thing. And we do see these opportunities somewhat being taken by some companies. I would say it's an absolute necessity. In the education space, you see more racial equity audits, I think, than in some other spaces, but it's overdue.
Right. Turning to both of you, I mean, Andrea, do you want to add on in response to Anita, or can I move to the next one?
No, go ahead to the next one.
Yeah, it's very simple, and it's a very broad-ranging question. Kind of, we have 6 minutes left, so I'm aware of the time, and questions are coming thick and fast too, which is all to do with how should racially and diversity and inclusion and equality be made mainstreamed. And one of the questions that 2 or 3 people have raised: how can it be made part of the investment processes? How can investors start thinking about it more. And related to that, which is not looking at just the finances, but Dominique, maybe you want to weigh in on this, is how can companies reach out to the communities in terms of getting the workers on the factory floor to be empowered? A lot of companies are very happy to stand beside Colin Kaepernick because it's a celebrity, and it's nice to have him and endorse him and be. But that's great, and I'm glad they are doing that. But how do we go out to reach out to the parts of the US and elsewhere where there are champions and who do need support?
I mean, let me say this, right? Today, a lot of companies are happy to stand with Colin Kaepernick. I will acknowledge many companies did before as well. But we are seeing this space, right? As public outrage mounts, people start negotiating again to preserve as much comfort and status quo as possible. So symbolic change that was impossible a month ago is all of a sudden welcomed today. And symbolic change is important, but the substantive change that you're asking about, I think, is also very key. And I think what's one interesting, I'll give a quick example so that Andrea can also respond. If you go on like Amazon Prime, you'll see the banner Black Lives Matter. Netflix has a Black Lives collection. But, I have students in New York City who work for Amazon, who work for Whole Foods in the factories, who have told me as we're doing Zoom classes that they're struggling to get a sick day. They need to bring a doctor's note. That some of us I had a mild case of COVID, some of us who've had COVID, who had 6-week cases and barely were able to leave the house, and we did not get tests because you weren't on a ventilator, right? My students, if they don't have a doctor's note, for every single day, we're actually facing a lot of backlash by Amazon, who's talking about Black Lives Mattering, and yet my Black students didn't ultimately feel that they could risk their jobs by taking a sick day. And so this is where you come back to Andrea's earlier point about the human rights context, about the ways in which the right to health absolutely impacts the ways that we understand racism. But in this exact space, like corporations, you don't actually need to look too deep. You kind of just need to open your eyes. Absolutely give us the symbolic change, bring down all the monuments, all of that. But at the same time, it's very important to recognize our internal practices that we might correlate with productivity. Don't apply at the very highest levels. You don't see CEOs killing themselves and bringing doctor's notes, but at the same time, the skepticism with which we look at Black illness and Black pain, that's been documented, right? Doctors don't see Black pain as pain, don't underdiagnose. The fact that we bring that into the corporate context, this is a moment to renegotiate that. That's just one example.
Yeah,
and
yes.
Yeah, it's the disconnect. We've seen these corporate leaders, marketing and communication departments making these pledges. And some of that I think is really important, especially in the US, as workers and employees are grappling with traumatic events. But that philanthropy and statements should just not be confused with what companies need to do under the UN Guiding Principles for Human Rights, right? And it is definitely about, do you have sick leave? Who are the most vulnerable in your company? Are you reinforcing the idea that Black people aren't in decision-making positions, that they are the lower paid, the most precarious, the ones that don't get sick, that don't get health care? It is so much more, and it needs attention in all the parts of the business to actually rethink what we think is just the assumption that we're being neutral or that we are being fair. And it's about understanding substantive equality. So I would say that disconnect is something that we just have to tackle.
Yeah, and substantive equality, there's a very great illustration, a cartoon that people have often used, that there are 3 children who are trying to watch a ball game and they're behind a wall, and one is tall, one is not, and the third child can't see it, and then you put stools. But that takes you to substantive equality. And then there's a fairness, which is what you break down the wall so that there's no wall separating the children. And I think that's the ultimate goal we want to go towards. We have 1 minute, and Dominique, I want to give you the last word.
No, I think this is a moment of unbelievable opportunity. And I think what we've seen, if nothing else, is that inside of our spaces, there is work to do. I think we can actually access our own people. When I actually work with companies and nonprofits around racism, I say, let's start with the hypotheticals about what people are saying internally here, and let's get through those. And you have to do it sensitively, but this is not a moment to hang back. This is a moment to step forward.
Yeah. yeah, we have to, walk, and we have to make sure that we are not only talking about it. Thank you so much, both Andrea in Italy and Dominique in the US. We could have easily taken another hour, and I'm sure there'll be another opportunity. We do want to look at other geographies, other regions where these problems are prevalent. We've done Britain the last week. We did the US. We are going to return to some of the other parts of the world. So do watch the space, and thank you so much. And yes, let's continue on our path. Thank you so much again. Yeah.
Thank you, Salil. Thank you, Dominique.
Thank you, Salil. Thanks, Andrea.